And welcome back, or welcome to the On Coaching podcast with Magness and Marcus. I am Steve Magness, the Deputy Director of High Performance West, joined by my good friend, colleague, John Marcus. John, how we doing?
We back, baby. Oh, man. Excited to give the people what they want. And speaking of being back and giving people what they want, we've got a new sponsor. Shout out to our new sponsor, Final Surge. That's a cool kids club for training and tracking your training online. Final Surge is used by, so many people. Our buddy Ben Rosario over at Northern Arizona Elite, Brad Hudson with Hudson Elite, the Hansons over at Brooks Hanson's running project, McMillan with McMillan Running, and then our friends down at Atlanta Track Club also use it as well. So it's definitely the cool kids club for tracking and planning and outlining your training online. They want you to train with a purpose, and that fits in exactly what Steve and I have been talking about for 3 going on 4 years. Train with a purpose and also be cool.
That is all our podcast is about.
Yes, that's all it's about.
And being cool. I don't know if I'm living up to that latter
No,
part.
definitely neither of us are living up to the latter part, but we're trying our best to do it with the former.
We are. So, once again, thanks to our sponsor, Final Surge. What's really cool about them is that athletes can sign up and use it for free. It's coaches who, if you want to use it for your coaching group, it costs $39 a month. It makes your life so much easier and simpler. It tracks everything. If you're a college coach, if you're a club coach, if you're starting your coaching business, I would highly recommend it. I use it myself with my college team. It's just easy. You can just go in there and instantly know what people are doing, get their feedback on it. It cuts down on the needless bureaucracy crap that normally happens with trying to track training. So highly recommend it. And for you guys, our loyal coaching listeners, they're going to give 10% off. Okay. So that's a sweet deal. All you have to do is enter the code ONCOACHING and you'll get 10% off. If you could do us a favor and go to the show notes on either Science of Running or High Performance West, we'll have a link there that, lets you guys get that discount and all that good stuff. So check that out. Give it up for our sponsor, Final Surge, which allows us to keep being able to do this week in and week out, while having our regular jobs and all that good stuff. So Final Surge, check it out in our show notes. So, what in the world are we going to be talking about today? So today is one of my favorite topics to dive into, and it's that you can't force improvement. Okay?
Speak.
It's that we, oftentimes as coaches, we're so goal-orientated, right? Where we say, okay, here's where the athlete is. I want to get them to this level, whether that's qualify for states or nationals or NCAAs or reach this PR. We're so focused on trying to get athletes where they need to be, right? So a lot of times in our coaching endeavors, what we do is we focus on, okay, this athlete has this goal. We need to train them to that level, right? Mm-hmm. And what happens is we start designing training around that, around not where they are, but where they want to be. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the dangers of that, about how we can't, if we always get in that mindset, we can't force an athlete to get somewhere. They have to naturally adapt and evolve to get there.
In American distance running or even coaching culture, right, it kind of, I think, originates back to Bowerman's concept of date pace and goal pace. And, that construct's very useful, right? So Bowerman would start a lot of the athletes at what they consider with their 3/4 time trials or 3/4 effort time trials as this is your current date pace. And then they plant the anchor and say, here's where you're at. You're at 430 mile date pace. So then we're going to systematically train you through the Bowerman systems framework from that to whatever our goal pace is. this arbitrary construct of this is what's competitive relative to other people in your conference or in the nation or what have you, right? And so now you're saying, well, you're at 430 mile pace and we need to get you to 356 mile pace in 9 months. So we're going to systematically try to move you down the road in that direction. Rationally, that's very attractive. It makes a lot of sense. It's like, okay, great. The inputs equals the output, right? And I remind athletes all the time. Actually, I was just having this conversation with an athlete I work with recently. In training and in racing, unfortunately, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. Sometimes 1 + 1 equals -10. And sometimes 1 + 1 equals 1,000. And we're sitting here trying to say, oh, well, if I do this training with this mileage, with these workouts, these inputs are going to correlate to this output, and I can guarantee 100% count on it, just like the sun coming up down the road when we quote unquote get to the championship period and peak. Not always the case. In fact, I think we have a little too much confirmation bias where it might work for 1 or 2 athletes in our stable of people that we work with. But what about the other 20, the other 30, if you're on a big high school team, the other 80? We have to step back and look and say, does this really work? Pigeonholing people and saying, you have to improve at this rate of improvement or else something's wrong with you because you're not fitting our system or our systematic approach.
Yeah. I think you brought in the point of control, right? And what happens is like that date pace, goal pace gives us like this idea of control, so that we feel like we have a handle on how things are going to progress and how athletes are going to adapt. But the reality is that adaptation is messy, right? I mean, how many times do you set up your training plan, your periodization, whatever it is, and you get to the first race and you're like, ooh, that was slower than I thought it would be. Or you get surprised, right? Where you're like, oh, they ran 20 seconds faster in the 5K than I thought they would, right? And that happens, more often than not. And that's because, well, we like to think that we can control that adaptation. The reality is that we kind of have, minimal guesswork influence on it, as the body's going to adapt how it wants to adapt.
And two, the environmental circumstances of an athlete's life will have a huge impact. If we go back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if someone doesn't have the core stabilities in their life, like really stable relationships, right? So stable friendships, stable family life, stable significant other, or if they had that and all of a sudden it was ripped away with, a loved one dying abruptly or a big breakup, that's going to have a huge impact, a traumatic impact that we can't necessarily objectively quantify. That's going to most likely adversely influence someone's ability to perform. And so we set up these wonderfully sophisticated, intelligent, step-by-step oriented training outlines, and yet we can't control all these external variables that happens with the life of being a human being. And sometimes we do have to step back as coaches and understand like that stuff does impact and influence the athlete's ability to step up and perform in whatever crucible it is, whether it's trying to qualify for the Boston Marathon or the Olympic trials or the national championships or a round out of that into the final. There's a lot of hidden factors and influences at play that aren't just directly physiological in nature that we can track with a heart rate monitor or a stopwatch.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex system, right? And like our models for handling it are very simple, right? We have like super compensation, stress and adaptation. Like you see these nice little charts in the book, including in my own book, which make it seem like that. But then you get out in the real world and you realize that it's complicated, right? It's a mess. I mean, there's been research on things like social environment and sickness and other things like that impacting like actual biological adaptation from workouts, which is fascinating to think about and see. And I think that gets us kind of back to this point of like you can't force improvement because it's impossible to know and it's impossible to control, right?
Well, don't mistake the map for the territory. That's a key principle. A lot of times we forget the map's the training plan, the map's the competition schedule, the map's the, inputs of volume and intensity and et cetera. But the territory, that day to day, the actual rocky crust that you're walking over, that is much different than your nice clean template on a sheet of paper. And so as coaches, we have to be, hyper fluent. My favorite Bruce Lee quote here, right? Be like water. You must be adaptable. You must be able to flow. You must be able to maintain the direction that you're going. And this is where I argue with people the difference between vision and goals. Goals are finite inputs, right? Goals are, I want to run 5 flat or break 5 for the mile. So 4:59.99 would be great. Versus a vision is a little bit different than a goal. A vision is infinite. A vision is saying, I want to be the most competitive I can possibly be at this race, at this time, at this place. And I want to, work and strive towards my ultimate personal expression of competitiveness. And that might be 5 flat, it might be 4:45, who knows, but I'm going to just invest in competitiveness. And even though it's not as quantifiable, and objective, the reality is the vision is what, that sight, that inspiration is what carries you, what keeps you fueled, what keeps the momentum moving forward, versus if you just have this clear, finite, I need to run this time, and once I run this time, the world will all of a sudden make sense, and everyone will be happy and nice to each other, and people won't get in Twitter wars or whatever. That's not reality, right? I get a lot of men who say, "Oh, I want to break 4 for a mile." But why? Why do you want to break 4 for a mile? Well, because then I'll be a really good runner. I go, guys. Many young college men break 4 for the miles indoors and don't even make it to the national championship. These are people's names that are not even on start lists at the, higher level races. It doesn't guarantee anything anymore, right? And so it might come from a space of status or notoriety, but the reality is we should pivot and have a clear vision about what type of performer that you're trying to build yourself into. And again, it's difficult because we want to think in linear growth trends, right? And we want to say, 1 + 1 = 2. And not always the case. I had a young athlete I was working with this year, and, she had a phenomenal year previously. And then this year was a little rocky. Her performance profile was up and down, up and down, up and down. But the body of work, the training, the load, the intensities, what she was able to do in practice for 9-10 months was very steady or trending upwards. There were no bad workouts, no huge errors, no big injury gaps. Nothing was wrong in that environment. But yet she's sitting here, questioning if she's as good as she was last year when she had more of a shaky season from a performance standpoint, which I get because performance is the ultimate grade, but at the same time too, it started to come together for her recently, and all of a sudden it's here's a PR in this secondary event. Oh, here's a season's best in this event. Oh, I closed really well this last lap, the fastest I've ever closed for my primary event. And it's now she's starting to see it all come together. I'm I thought I was done. I thought I was just cooked. I go, no, we overcame some other external or secondary and tertiary barriers, in your life and how you approach performance. And then now you're able to express where you're really at. But again, had we sit here and just try to force and force and force and force, we probably would have ended up burning her out or getting her hurt.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that often happens. Is that when we encounter those difficulties, our fallback is to force things. Because we get in a point where it's he or she isn't running well. What do we do? Well, let's try and do, this workout or increase this or increase strength training or increase this mileage or change something, because it's obviously not working. And sometimes what happens is if things are going relatively well, it's just waiting for that adaptation and fitness to be able to be expressed, right? It's not like the training is being wasted. It's just you can't express it in this moment because something else is blocking it, right? Or something else is preventing it from coming out at this moment. And that's kind of a fairly common thing. And it's the way I like to envision is it's this mismatch between maybe your physical capacity and your race performance because they haven't synced up yet. And that's totally fine. But I think going back to the point you made on the don't mistake the map for the territory, I think that's incredibly important because as a coach, a lot of times what happens is we get so sold on the training plan that we forget that it's not the thing that driving it is. The thing that driving is the athlete and how they're responding and doing in workouts. And I think as a coach, if you can set up checkpoints or reminders for you to do that comparison of what's the map say, what's the territory look like, right? And to recalibrate, just like we would if we were driving around with our map and took a wrong turn. We'd recalibrate, or our GPS would nowadays, and get us going in the right direction. And I think far too often coaches don't do that calibration to make sure that, they've adjusted to whatever life has thrown at them. And I think one of the things that is always interesting to me is when I go into a workout and I'm looking for a little of that calibration, I'll kind of predict what I think the athlete will do and how difficult it will be for them to do it, right? If we have 400s and they're supposed to be a mile pace and I think, they'll probably hit them in 60 and it'll be a 7 out of 10, right? And then going back afterwards and checking with the athlete and seeing what they did both from a running standpoint, but also how they felt and how they experienced it. Like that's the act of recalibrating. If they come in and they say that was a 10 out of 10, but I hit the times, well, that gives me some data. If they say it's a 5 out of 10 and they hit the times, then I'm like, okay, that tells me something else. So I think that calibration point, and constantly or, maybe somewhat frequently as a coach, checking to see if your map matches up with the data or what you're seeing out on the track is a incredibly important lesson to have.
Yeah, like Vern Gambetta says, right? You need to coach the person. And I take that one step further, like coach the person, don't coach the spreadsheet. And if you're coaching the training plan and you're trying to get the person to fit into your little training plan, like that's good, that's nice, but I think, you're doing it wrong because the person is far more important than the plan. Now, we must plan. Planning is important. You have to have a direction and you have to know, a destination to where you want to go without a doubt. Otherwise, you're just wandering and training aimlessly. But there's going to be detours, right? There's going to be dead ends. There's going to be pivots. There's going to be injuries, illnesses. There's going to be things that happen. And if you're really cognizant of that you're here environment coaching the person, and then you're able to step away from the training plan and say, well, maybe this direction is not working, or maybe these inputs aren't having the right benefit, or maybe it's how they're approaching and you're approaching the plan. Creating, like you said, Steve, small wins along the path, whether they're small wins in training or small wins in kind of building up in checkpoints of racing. That's important, and to clearly define what the small win looks like. In sprinting and jumping world, they do testing, right? So they'll do 2-3 week cycles of training, and then they'll have a rest week, and at the end of that rest week, like in the off season, they'll test. And they want to create stepping stones with these tests, and they keep the tests they have constant. It can be a standing broad jump. It can be the average of 3 times 30 meter flies, or accelerations, and it's to give the person a little bit of feedback and also the coach to say, okay, we're trending in the right direction. And that to me is more what training's about, trends. Taking a step back, looking at what are the trends and not just being solely a slave to the stopwatch or the heart rate monitor or some objective, number, and this is the holy grail, but taking that holistically in, and like you said, what's the control? What's the capacity of the athlete to do it? I was, having this conversation with a couple of pros I worked with, I go, we don't need to get you guys faster. We don't need to run 200s faster. We don't need to run 400s faster. We don't need to run, mile repeats faster. We just need to run them better. We need to run them with more control, with more like, okay, great. That only required half a tank to do this, not 3/4 of a tank. That only required so much of my mental fortitude and focus today. It didn't require like me to go deep to the well. And I think as we age as coaches and we get more experience, what the numbers in training say matter less and less and less. And it's more how the athlete does it in training that matters more and more and more. And sometimes the forcing improvement comes from this need to increase or better the numbers that you're seeing in training. Okay, they ran their tempo run at 5:10 pace, for 4 miles this week. In 2-3 weeks, okay, we want you to run them 5 flat. Okay, and then we want you, you just step up 10 seconds per 10 seconds per 10 seconds, right? And all of a sudden, oh, great, you're running, your tempo's in 4:45 and you're ready to make nationals, and all of a sudden, in cross country or something, and then they get 213th at regionals and you're like, uh-oh, what happened?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that like need for control, right? Or that need for reassurance. And that happens often when you're a young athlete or even a young coach. On the high school and collegiate level, I see it all the time with driven athletes. They come in and they try and kill every workout, right? They try and just show up and dominate it and improve every single workout. Every single time they do mile repeats, they try and go faster and all that stuff. And then what I inevitably see is the older the experienced ones, the ones who figure it out, they're just trying to get the work in, right? They're just trying to get what they need out of the workout and not prove themselves every workout, right? They know that if they stack week after week of good, solid workouts, like you talked about, winning more workouts. My high school coach, Gerald Stewart, used to say the key to training is winning more workouts than you lose. Right? And they know if they can do that rather than knock it out of the park all the time or get faster every time, even if it means they run the same repeats, but they do it feeling a certain way or feeling a little bit better or more in control, then their fitness is improving. So it's really that transition of that mindset for an athlete, but also as a coach where you don't need that constant reinforcement of these athletes are getting better. It's funny looking out through my coaching now is I used to rely on the workouts to tell me what kind of maybe fitness athletes are in, but now it's almost this intuitive feel thing, right? Where you can tell, you look at the data and the numbers and all that stuff, but you can almost feel the athlete building that momentum where it's like, okay, this one's coming around. This one's get it. We're trending, as you said, in the right direction. All the trends are pointing upwards. Like they're gonna run well. What that run well means, who knows? But like they're going to run well.
It's a BioWork, right? So you're looking at everything that they're doing from a work and then absorption standpoint. So they ran a 14-mile tempo run on Sunday. They took a double recovery run on Monday. They came back and they did 16 times a quarter on Tuesday, and they felt fresh. They felt like, I felt good. This was great, and they had this air and this positivity about them, and like that's the ideal world, right? Or they felt flat on the quarters, and then you have to make those tweaks and adjustments. Say, okay, you're not there yet, but why? And then you ask, but why? How's your sleep? How's your relationship? How's all these external things that are impacting you? And the reality is, right, I was talking to a coach at the national championships in Des Moines recently. The reality is now we all have to become, as coaches, a lot more cognizant and aware of depressive thoughts and personality traits in athletes. I think there was a recent study that showed that was floating around online about almost 1/4 of women in NCAA track and field have depressive thoughts or depressive instincts sometimes. And, that's the reality of the world we live in, right? I mean, Steve went on a little rant recently about put the cell phone down because it's, basically a slot machine for dopamine, and it creates an addiction. And we're highly addictive entities as human beings. We can get addicted to improving. We can get addicted to Instagram. We can get addicted to alcohol. We can get addicted to trading, right? And so you have to also be aware of the mind space someone's in too. And if what training is becoming is this addictive impulse of just trying to track improvement, however it is, more miles, faster workouts, etc. And then what happens when they start to plateau, or what happens when they start to backslide? And that's more than ever where we need to engage in face-to-face real relationships with people that are not through the portal of some screen.
Yeah, exactly. It's that getting addicted to just improvement or whatever it is that can kind of drive things. And I think that's where we look at when we come back to forcing workouts, is that's what it is. Like we become consumed or addicted by trying to get athletes to a certain level, right? And what happens is we step away from letting adaptation be the driver, right? And the thing that is dictating how far we progress. And we make it like our want or our need to, get an athlete to a certain level. I mean, plug in anything. There's certain calculators online that you can plug in. Okay, if I run, if I'm trying to run 15 minutes for a 5K, what should my mile repeats be at? And it'll tell you, right? And that's, to me, that is looking at forcing adaptation instead of letting the adaptation drive. And I think this really comes down to is when you're looking at workouts and pushing workouts is what is the thing that is determining how far or how fast you're pushing them? Are you trying to get your athlete to run faster so that it proves that they can run a certain time? Or are you letting them kind of adapt and go with it based on their fitness is improving, and therefore they need a higher stress and a higher stimulus and et cetera, so that they can run faster in the workout?
And the longer I coach, the more I just trend towards boring work, because boring work, again, it ensures a body of work. And that's really what we're trying to do, right? You hear it all the time, consistency and patience and all these things. Yet, how do you meet that demand as a coach where you have a season for cross country or track or marathon season, and you're trying to ready the athlete to be in this type of form by this time of the year? And it's like, or a team, right? We got to push this team to be in this type of form. And really the reality is just keep showing up and doing boring work after boring work. Just don't miss it. And, I've worked with athletes who have had prior coaches where they were the most insane, eye-popping workouts, and, they'd come and just drill this stuff like, women doing mile repeats at sub-5-minute pace with like 2 minutes rest, and oh my gosh, they're ready to like run a world-class level, but yet performance would never support preparation because it just took everything out of them to crank those workouts time and time again. And then, we work together and with an athlete, and it's just like, all right, this is real boring. We're going to do mile repeats at like 5:10. Yeah, I know in 2-3 years ago you were able to do them at 4:50, but we're just going to do 5:10. And then all of a sudden it's like humongous gains in performance because we just were in kind of the right zone that was, kind of the Goldilocks syndrome, right? Not too much, not too little, just right. And it's nothing to write home about. It's nothing to like tweet about. It's nothing to say, hey, look at me, I crushed this session. Because again, what preparation should do is support performance. It should ready someone to perform. But how do we get there in a traceable, logical, predictable manner? And the answer is we really don't, right? The answer is it's more, we have these mental models that help us create these constructs of improvement and ways to progress and step forward. But one of my favorites, coaching methods is, that floats around out there, is not actually making big steps in what training paces and loads are until the performance and an athlete's performance supports that. So waiting for that breakthrough, not forcing that breakthrough, saying, okay, we're going to get faster every week here in training. We're going to stay really boring. We're going to stay very consistent at these different paces for threshold or 3K pace or what have you until your performance supports that, until you have that big breakthrough. And then when you do, then we'll step up. And then when we'll do, you have to be really strong as a coach, and the athlete has to be really confident as a performer to know that a lot of intelligent, purposeful, boring, consistent work is actually the thing that's going to support the breakthrough, not these rock star workouts at these rock star paces. And a lot of times we see that, right? We want to see what were Alan Webb's workouts in 2007 when, he had this he had basically, the most crazy year ever for an American miler from a time standpoint. But go back to 2005 and 2004 when it's like pretty boring, but that supported the space that he got to in 2007, right? Because it's your education, what you learn in third grade matters in fifth grade, which matters in eighth grade, and it all builds and builds and builds. And to say we have a systematic approach that, we can guarantee this turnover happening in fitness, I think is a little hubristic, and we need, as coaches, need to take a step back and take a deep drink of water and a clear breath and get sober and say, what is the vision for this athlete? The vision is to get them to compete at whatever level or whatever state of competency, in this time frame, and we need to support that vision. Now, the goal may be you got to hit this time to qualify to regionals or nationals or whatever, but take a step back and more panoramic approach and say, here's the vision, and here are the small wins along the way that will support and shepherd this athlete towards this vision. But if you have more of that infinite mentality, and again, this is, James Carse has a great book. It's called Finite and Infinite Games, and I've been reading it more and more and more and revisiting it. And people who are playing the infinite game tend to outlast and play the game better than people who are playing the finite game. And a quick example of that is look at Microsoft versus Apple. Apple is playing the infinite game. We want to help teachers teach better, help students learn better. Microsoft is playing the finite game, saying we want to beat Apple. We want to beat them. We want to be number one in market share, number one in revenue. And it's interesting when that culturally you're obsessed about this finite outcome from a Microsoft standpoint versus Apple's more obsessed about, in general, an infinite outcome about creating this vision of creating a better civilization. It's no wonder culturally why they're, much different spaces, even from a revenue and from a product creation standpoint. Same deal here if we extrapolate that down to our level as coaches. If your goal is saying, I want, Susie to beat Sarah at the championship, and it's all that matters. But if you say, well, I want Susie to be able to compete at her highest threshold ever and perform, at a national class level and just do her thing to her fullest, and we're going to build her towards there, you kind of take the ceiling off. And sometimes when we force improvement, we create this ceiling, we create this relative threshold of saying, well, you need to be in, 415, 1500 meter shape, or else all the work is worth nothing this year, or all this, and then the athlete starts to not run 415, they run 420, they run 422, they run 417, but you're saying you have to get to this 415 threshold, and then it creates this burden on the athlete. And I've lived it far too much as a coach. And I've made that mistake far too often, and I see my some peers and colleagues continue to do that, and it creates this, pressure, it creates this weight on an athlete's shoulders, and then they're not having any fun at all come race day because they didn't hit this arbitrary threshold mark of 415 that we laid out there because that's their goal or that's what you told them they have to do.
Yeah, there's two big components that I brought out of what you just said. Is number one, it's you have to earn your right to run faster, right? Mm-hmm. It's not given to you. You have to earn and prove it. And I think in a training standpoint, you see that all the time where it's easy for an athlete to sit back and say, I want to do this, right? I want to run X in the 5K or Y in the 1500. And I'll have athletes come to me, I want to run, this many miles this summer. Okay, it's easy to want to do that, but in order to actually get there, you have to earn your right to do that work, right? You have to show some sort of ability to handle or some sort of ability to adapt or some sort of ability to run those speeds versus me being wishful and saying, you know what, I need you to be able to, run this in cross country. So I'm going to give you this crazy training that's more than you've ever done just because I need you to. And maybe if we throw enough eggs against the wall, something will stick. I don't subscribe to that coaching philosophy. And instead I subscribe to what you just explained, earn your right to run faster. And then
Mm-hmm.
I think the other part of that you talked about there is that barriers part is, are we creating artificial limits, right? And when we sit there and we say, all right, like this is what we need to do to run 4:15 in the 1500, and this is our goal, and this is what we're training towards. What we've done is we've given the athletes a definition for success and failure without them really having much thought or input into it, right? We've just shifted our definition of success and failure to this one parameter of I need to run this or it's no good, right? And now we've, probably unknowingly changed their whole motivation for the game, right? Now they're driven by having to prove themselves. They're having to run this time. And if they don't, then, they're shit out of luck. And I think, when we do that, we're actually just setting our athletes up to fail. Well, we think that like we're forcing them to try and get to a new level.
Mm-hmm. And this is like, I lived this last year with, say, Daniel Herrera, right? When he broke 4 minutes for the mile 3 times in 3 different months. We never talked about breaking 4 minutes for a mile. Nowhere in the training, nowhere in the debriefs, nowhere in the goal setting, nowhere, I need to break 4 for the mile. Nowhere going into the races was like, okay, we need you to break 4, No, the whole conversation, dialogue was around being competitive at a certain level against a certain caliber of athletes that were kind of in his generation, and saying, I want to beat and be and run with these guys. I want to be in a space where I can, compete against them. And maybe I win, maybe I don't, but I'm there, I'm in the arena in the last lap, last 60 seconds on a road mile, whatever. I'm at this level, I'm on par. And so we train more towards that. And it was never in a workout, it's never, okay, this is your workout to prime you and ready you to break 4 and, the mile. And when it came by surprise to everybody, solely because it was just like this nice kudos, but it wasn't anything we ever discussed. And, contrast that with like the prior year when, he was obsessing about running a certain qualifying time in the 1500, so far away from it, even though training supported his ability to do it, but mentally and emotionally, he looked at this, qualifying time as Mount Everest and the peak. And he had to like, how am I going to get up this mountain? It's so hard. It seems so fast. And he started to rationally unwind himself in races because he's keeping an eye on the clock as he's competing versus keeping an eye on his competitors. And remember, competition can bring out the best in us. That's why we do it. That's why we show up to races. Because competition, you see it all the time, right? And, these pundits go, how is everyone run so fast in the rounds at, a championship, or run so fast in the rain and not the best conditions at a championship? It's because it's a championship. It's a competition. What matters is trying to best the others' best efforts and contribute to that on race day. And so we kind of, a lot of the people who end up winning, they don't talk about, I was trying to negative split this or do that. They talk about, I felt this, my competitor coming at me and they pushed and I pushed back and all of a sudden, boom. And then they run a crazy PR in the process while winning or getting second or et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's funny how, even at NCAAs, right? It's raining, it's all this stuff. And people are like, how is everyone running fast? Including in the sprints, right? It's raining and it's cold. And we had Houston set the 4x100 collegiate record, right?
Right, yeah.
That shouldn't happen in those conditions, right? And we, knowing our coaches and stuff, like they would travel to meets and try and get great weather all year to do it. And, a whole conference avoids the pin relays to try and get better weather so they can run fast. But here, in this suboptimal conditions, athletes run really fast. And that's because it's the goal and focus of attention on things, right? No one's worried really about running times at NCAAs or some championship meet. They are just worried about competing with others and winning. And I can speak on, the opposite end of that sub 4, attack, because I remember as a high schooler going through it, is I had zero awareness of any possibility of running sub 4 until like somehow I made my way down to 4:03 and was like, oh shit, like this is a thing. But like to get there, all I was doing was racing and running hard. And, you know, my splits were all over the place. But like I knocked my mile time down from like 4:17 all the way down just by getting in races and going for it and seeing what happened. I had no idea what I was actually trying to do in terms of time wise. I was just trying to run as fast and win the races. And I think once I got into, oh, this is a barrier, like this is something that I should target. Now all of a sudden I went from racing to at every 200 or 400, like I knew exactly where I was, right? I knew I could see the clock go from 59 to 60 or 2:59 to 3 minutes or to 3:01 or whatever it is. And that changes your focus of attention, which ultimately changes your performance outcome. Mm-hmm. And whether it's in training or in racing, like that's a great example of in racing trying to force your way to get to some sort of barrier or to some sort of PR. And I always tell my athletes, like, if you're finding yourself trying to force yourself to run a certain time, whether that's 5 minutes in the mile or 4 minutes, like you're handicapping yourself because you've shifted that attention. You've put the focus, you've defined success in a way that is unsustainable, where you're going to fail more times than not, right? And every time you fail, you're reinforcing the idea of your body being like, well, why are we trying? Why are we going to push so hard? We're not going to accomplish our goal, so we should just settle. And I think that's kind of the takeaway on what happens when you start to really force things.
And you start doing calculations, right? You start doing calculations in your head and you're saying, what's the cost benefit analysis of this? You know, continue to press. I don't feel good. That was a 60 last lap. I feel awful. And, you know, you start doing that.
And that's what happens, like, even if we're not aware of it, right? Go watch a championship style 1500 meter heat, right? And you'll see, like, it's tactical. They start closing, and inevitably someone in the back, you know, while everyone else is closing in 53, 54, someone in the back closes in 64. Were they dead tired? Were they not capable of it? No. Yeah. But like they just saw their defining goal was, I have to place top X to make it. They see it go away. And even if they're trying, quote unquote, to run fast, like their body's just like, well, we're not going to do it. So we're going to shut you down. Like there's no point in trying to do this, right? And your body
they get disheartened.
Yep. You'll just be shut down. And that's what happens when we define our goals in ways that make it where there's a clear win or a clear loss. And if we're looking like we're heading to a clear loss, like our body's going to win and it's going to shut you down and you're going to go backwards.
Yeah, and mathematics are really important. Like, you know, what mathematics do is they simplify and they streamline and they make very clear, messy, complex, the reality of life. And so we do depend on mathematics and numbers in training, right? Heart rate, splits, mileage, etc. Those are important numerical inputs to consider. But we can't shy away from the fact that mathematics is just a construct and a model to help us interpret the messiness about life and training. And so when, you know, I always ask people, like, when do you start calculating in a race? Because when you can tell when someone starts calculating, they start just thinking about the wrong things in a competitive arena rather than being more, like, as we say, in the moment, in a state of flow, very present, focused, you know, just making good decisions, you know, staying on task with their thoughts that are there, keeping them present step by step versus saying, oh, I don't know if I have another lap at this pace in me. And, you know, you see it more and more and more, especially it's magnified like in 5Ks and more so 10Ks on the track. Like someone's right there, they're in the pack. You know, I mean, you can watch any 10K, right? And then all of a sudden you get to a lap and they were right there on the tail end of the pack and now they're 15 meters behind in less than 400 meters. What happened, right? They just reached a threshold where in the 10K, there's a lot of time to think. And if you're thinking and calculating in the wrong direction, that's the trend your running goes as well. And a lot of times it's this misnomer, right? People want racing to be easy. Oh, I want it just to feel comfortable and controlled. But that's unfortunately not reality. You can tolerate the speed of play. You can find a way to be competitive, and even though it's very difficult and all these inputs in your body are saying, oh my gosh, why are you doing this? This is so, freaking hard, you're redlining. And yeah, at a certain point, physiologically, you can't outrun that. And if you start to, go in the opposite way of where your training or your threshold affords, yeah, you're going to blow up. But the reality is we can sustain ourselves a lot longer than we should at a certain tempo or rhythm if we're engaged and we're focused and we're in the moment and we're interpreting the competitive experience in a way that's of benefit. And this is really hard stuff, right? This is why we have sports psychologists or performance psychologists. This is why there's a big difference between people who are at the higher competitive levels and stay at those levels through high school, college, and post-collegiately, and people who enjoy a little bit of success in the scholastic years, but then kind of wander and are aimless and don't find success or are far away from success and come back to successful results in their post-collegiate years, because this is a difficult path and a difficult world to navigate. But by simply, saying how we're going to improve is from a numerical input to output equation, and that's our standard, I think it cheapens the training and competitive experience for athlete and coach. And then it creates this frustration on everyone's part because we agreed that what we're trying to improve is these numerical outputs based on these numerical inputs. And then the athlete buys into this because it's rational, it's logical, it's firm, it's concrete. You have this control, it makes sense. We have these pace charts, right? Or we have these pace calculators. If you run this pace for half marathon, you can run this pace for a 10K and this pace for a 5K. And how much of that is just confirmation bias, and how much of that is just, kind of this narrative where we believe it to be true, so we manifest it to be true versus actual real truth. And I was talking this last weekend with Trent Slingworth, a renowned sports scientist in Canada, and his wife Hillary was a listener to the podcast. Hi, Hillary. And Trent and I were talking. Steve's talked to Trent many times, and Trent's like, yeah. One of the things I'm always trying to do with a lot of studies in the lab is try to say, okay, how can we take these studies that we're doing in the lab about, this thing or that or this, and then give it so there's a applicable translation to the coach in the field, because the circumstance in the lab, the kind of nice little, incubated bubble in the lab, he knows, just from being a coach himself and, being married to an Olympian and now coach, it doesn't always translate to the reality in the field of practice. And it's great to see someone like Trent, who has access and a mind and is trying to inch people more towards this, this way of saying, well, what we have in the lab cannot directly transfer to the field, but how do we get it to empower the coach's decision and athlete's decision-making process? So we have these scientific inputs and studies, and we have these things, so that we're not creating an environment of frustration on everyone's part as we exit out of the lab and onto the track or onto the field.
Yeah, exactly, and that's like the golden problem, right? Is how do you solve that problem? And I think that's always the conundrum in translating science to practice.
It's an interpretation, right?
Yeah.
Like you really have to interpret it, and I think that's why if you notice, like a lot of master coaches, they read very widely. That was one epiphany I had when I was talking to like a Vern Gambetta or Stu McMillan or Dan Path, is like their reading is not solely just scientific articles and training blogs or things of that nature, or things that are just in the sports performance realm. They're up to date on that. They stay current, and they know their history really well as well. But it's also too a lot of philosophy, a lot of like human relations, a lot of other things, history on world figures, like things we wouldn't think a coach would read about, they're reading about why, because they all swear it makes their coaching better and it makes the athlete better.
Yeah, exactly. I'll never forget. I remember my high school coach read Running with the Buffaloes. And in that book, it mentioned that Mark Wetmore thought that a great coaching book was the electric Kool-Aid acid test.
Yeah.
So my coach went and read it and was like, that was the strangest book I've ever read, but okay. But like that got to the point, and that hits that point home, is that a lot of times, and this is a tangent, but a lot of times the best coaching insights are pulled from things outside of our domain. And if there's ever anything that I've evolved from my beginning to where I'm at from a coach now, is my beginning reading was all contained in the coaching running world. And you have to do that, right? You have to have your foundation and your knowledge. But as you grow, you start pulling things from all these disparate sources, all outside of the domain. And I think that's incredibly valuable lessons for anybody who's listening. And maybe to bring things all together, in some way, it's the same in terms of knowledge, and coaching, right? When we're young and we're looking for knowledge, right? We go to the sources that give us the concrete answers, right? We go to the training manuals. We go to the calculators. We go to, here's all the training programs in this book that, so-and-so did or such and such coach did to get really good. Because they provide easy answers. But as we grow and develop as coaches, we start looking at the abstract and start looking at how can we, connect these things and get athletes to be better people, performers, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of times those answers are outside of those cookie cutter, or sorry to say, but like outside of our sport domain that gives us the exacting answers. So it's like branching out. And in the same way, we can't force, ourselves to be great coaches. We cannot force our athletes to, artificial performance standards. And if I could give any advice or could summarize this any way, it's to let the athlete and the adaptation drive things, right? How are they improving? Check it in, check your map versus your territory. See if it matches up, and if not, adjust. But you can't force an athlete to reach some different level. You have to let them get to that level. And your job as a coach is essentially to kind of steer and guide and let them bounce back and forth, but not sway too far in the wrong direction, and keep them on a path headed towards, reaching some sort of performance standard or performance goal. But it's not to be behind them, pushing, forcing them to get there. Just as we wouldn't, force force our child to try and become some prodigy at music or baseball or soccer or whatever it is. We've all seen that, fail incredibly by parents, who have good intentions, but, it doesn't work out. You create bad patterns when you start to force things. And it's the same in coaching. It's the same in training design. Like when we start to force workouts or force athletes to try and nail different things to prove they're at fitness, it promotes bad habits.
And you rob the fun out of the activity, right? That's part of being in the flow state, is a competency, but also an enjoyment. And if you're saying that why you're doing this, or the reason we're doing all this training, or why this team exists, is to solely hit these arbitrary standards of time or a place, you rob all the enjoyment from the athlete. And so if the goal is to get first in the race, and the athlete gets third and runs, a brilliant executed race, the race of their life, they PR, they run like the last section of the race, the fastest ever, but they got third, they're super depressed and, pouty and upset, even though all other metrics, from anyone watching them is like, oh my God, it's amazing. That's awesome. Yeah, it's great to have really high standards. It's great to want to win, but don't rob the athlete of the enjoyment of sport. An enjoyment of sport is in the preparation, it's in the execution, and it's in the, fulfillment of saying, I did something and I created something that didn't exist before, which was, whether running this championship style race effectively, or running this PR. Like, we underestimate that athletes are performance artists, and they're birthing things from scratch. They're birthing into creation these performances that didn't exist until they put one foot in front of the other, or until they worked in a team setting, which is phenomenal, right? And I think to add to what Steve said is we have to be really clear about expectations. And I'm learning this more and more and more, especially working with, more of an adult population. Expectations might not align, and you have to keep coming back and say, well, what do you expect? What is your expectation? And if their athlete's expectation is this consumer coaching, as I call it, where it's like coach writes the training plan, athlete does the work, and then magically, through no effort on the athlete's part at all, they just magically show up to race day and get better. And that's kind of the consumer coaching promise, right? If you do my 3-month training plan, you will improve 15%. And it's like, I have the formula. It's the guaranteed 15% improvement formula. And that sounds really attractive, but that's not reality by any means.
Oh, man.
I know I just ruined your whole next book, Steve. I'm sorry. The 15% improvement method.
That was it. It was going to be my money back guarantee, right? My late night shopping, money back guarantee coaching. That's how it is.
But that's where you start to force, that's where things get forced, and the athlete starts to get sour, because the athlete's expectation was, well, I'm going to do all this work only because I want the payoff of this improvement, and that's the only reason they're doing it, and they can't sustain the enjoyment of just doing the work day in and day out, even though they might go through a frustrating period of lack of performance lacking, what they want and not being at the level they want. Those dips happen. The dip's real. It's a real phenomena, the dip. Seth Godin wrote a book called The Dip, which expresses exactly this, where you have you get into something, new knowledge, new experience, and you have this rapid growth and improvement, and you have this little mini summit, but then you start to descend, and that's when you have to know, do you cut the cord and walk away and cut ties and just cut your losses, or do you continue to trudge forward? Because this descent is just a momentary descent for a small period of time that's then going to translate to an ascent to even a higher peak. And that dip happens, and it happens. I experience it in my coaching all the time. It's like, I think I know things. I think I have a way, and okay, this training philosophy or this way about making these decisions is yes, it's working. The performance that athletes are enjoying right now are supporting this. Okay, great. And then the next season, don't change anything, and everyone gets hurt and sick and runs poorly. And you're like, what happened? Nothing happened from the previous year to the next year. It's just, we take sometimes too myopic a feedback and say, oh, well, this year it just all went to bunk, so let me just scrap everything and go a whole new different direction, when sometimes you just have a bad year, and it just happens, right? The years just, you can look at say, Steve and myself, right? Coached, women who won the back to back, right? Myself and then Steve worked with women who won the U.S. national marathon title, and then now both, for different reasons, one's sick, one's moving away from, competitive running. It's not there anymore. But they were the last two ones to win. And it doesn't mean we're bad people or coaches, or they're bad athletes or not. It's just fortunes change swiftly in life. And sometimes we have to just be very cognizant of that and not force development or force improvement because we're caught up in this linear growth model where we need to just step, and one up the most recent thing. Because it's going to be that mindset, that linear growth mindset. It's very simplistic, and unfortunately is going to create a lot more frustration than elation in yourself and the athletes that you might be working with.
You know what? I think it actually does mean that we're bad coaches. That's number one. But you know what? You know how not to be a bad coach?
How?
Well, if you use this thing called Final Surge to compare your map versus your territory, because it allows you to see right in front of you all the data, all the athletes being able to comment. Great for summer cross-country training when they're all for colleges and high school where they're all sent off where they live and doing training. You get that feedback. You get tracking all sorts of stuff if you want to. They just introduced a pain and fatigue tracker that you can utilize. And it's great for comparing that map to territory. So if you're interested, check out in the show notes on Science of Running or highperformancewest.com, or just go to finalsurge.com/on-coaching. So want to be a better coach than us, you should, probably utilize these things that, allow you to, so that you don't mess up athletes like John and I often do. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We're glad to be back. We're going to be cranking these out. Again, in addition to Final Surge, check out the things that we're doing. We're on a little vacation break on High Performance West, but we've got a lot of cool stuff up there. We're still going strong with the Scholar Seminar, which is John and I curating and putting out some exclusive and awesome content. I just recorded a 20-minute video explaining energy systems that will go up on there. Yes, nice. It costs money, but it's what supports these endeavors in addition to our great sponsors, but it also, sports, helps support our clubs and, athletes and all that stuff too. So, we're just trying to do our little part of, coaching and running world. So help us, join us on that mission. If you have any questions, hit us up on, Twitter or email or wherever you can find us, which we're all over the place. So it shouldn't be that hard.
Yeah, no, and it's really fun to do, right? And I think it's been great, this journey, working with a lot of, interacting with a lot of listeners and also readers now, especially like when we're at meets, and we listen too. Like if you do have a topic that you want Steve and I to chew on for the podcast, or even just, whether it be a blog post or, some type of technical issue, you may have, reach out, as many coaches can empathize. The last couple of months when you're in championship season, it's very emotional, draining, and taxing, and also just you're going meet to meet, and dealing with a lot of things. So yeah, we're just like you. We get a little bogged down, but now summer's about recharging, reconnecting, and re-inspiring and re-engaging. So again, if you have things you want, we try to make ourselves as accessible as possible. So reach out. We've had several podcasts which have been topics driven by listeners who are like, hey, can you guys, riff on these things or those things? And by all means, we're here to give the people what they want. And what you guys want, we want to deliver. So let us know. Twitter is probably the easiest way to get a hold of us. Direct message us, let us know, and we'll be back all summer long, all year long, giving the people what they want.